I have always been the kind of person who arrives everywhere at least 15 minutes early. My grandmother used to say that being on time is actually being late, and that philosophy became deeply ingrained in who I am. The stress of running behind schedule makes my chest tight and my palms sweaty, so I built my entire routine around avoiding that feeling at all costs. My name is Mathia Rodriguez, and I work in logistics coordination for Cascade Distribution Company here in Portland, Oregon. At 29 years old, I have developed what most people would call an obsession with punctuality, but I prefer to think of it as professional reliability. Every morning followed the same ritual. I would wake up at 6:30, shower, get dressed in my standard work attire of dark slacks and a blouse, grab my purse and keys, and head out the door by 7:15 for my 8:30 start time. The drive from my apartment in the Hawthorne district to our warehouse facility near the airport was exactly 32 minutes on a normal day, but I always gave myself a full hour. Traffic in Portland can be unpredictable, especially during the rainy season when every fender bender turns into a major backup. My first stop was always Grind Coffee on Southeast Division. The baristas knew my order by heart: medium dark roast with a splash of oat milk, no sugar. I would spend exactly 3 minutes in line, pay with my card, exchange pleasantries about the weather, and walk back to my Honda Civic with the warm cup cradled in my hands. The coffee was never just about the caffeine, though I certainly needed that. It was about those 30 minutes of driving meditation, sipping something comforting while listening to my carefully curated playlist of indie folk and alternative rock. Those moments in the car were my transition time, my way of mentally preparing for whatever challenges the day might bring. Cascade Distribution was not a bad place to work, generally speaking. We handled logistics for several major retail chains throughout the Pacific Northwest, coordinating shipments and managing inventory data. The work was steady, the pay was decent, and most of my coworkers were reasonable people just trying to get through their days. The warehouse floor buzzed with the constant activity of forklifts and conveyor belts, while those of us in the office coordinated everything from behind our computer screens. I had been there for 3 years, and had earned a reputation for being reliable, thorough, and never causing drama. My supervisor, however, was a different story entirely. Derek Hoffman was one of those middle management types who seemed to derive genuine pleasure from wielding what little authority he had been given. He was in his early 40s, balding, and had the kind of mustache that suggested he took himself far more seriously than anyone else did. Derek had been promoted to supervisor about 8 months ago, and ever since then, he had been looking for ways to assert his dominance over our small team. He would hover around our desks, making unnecessary comments about our work, and seemed to take particular joy in catching people in minor infractions of company policy. The company handbook was Derek's Bible. He knew every rule, every procedure, every potential penalty, and he was not shy about reminding us of them. One policy that he particularly enjoyed enforcing was the tardiness rule. According to the official guidelines, being less than 5 minutes late was considered acceptable and would not result in disciplinary action. However, being 5 minutes or more late, regardless of the reason, could result in a written warning. The handbook specifically stated that the penalty was the same whether you were 5 minutes late or 5 hours late. It was a blanket policy designed to simplify the disciplinary process, but it also created some interesting loopholes for anyone clever enough to exploit them. Most supervisors use their discretion when applying this rule. If someone was occasionally a few minutes late due to traffic or other reasonable circumstances, most managers would let it slide, especially if the employee was otherwise reliable. Derek, however, saw the tardiness policy as an opportunity to demonstrate his authority and keep his team in line through fear and intimidation. For nearly 3 years, I had never been written up for anything. I arrived early almost every single day, completed my work efficiently, and maintained positive relationships with my colleagues. I was exactly the kind of employee that any reasonable supervisor would want on their team. Derek, unfortunately, was not a reasonable supervisor. The incident that changed everything happened on a Tuesday morning in late October. The weather had been typical for Portland in the fall, with intermittent rain showers and overcast skies that made everything feel gray and dreary. I followed my usual routine that morning. Wake up at 6:30, get ready, leave the apartment at 7:15, stop at Grind Coffee for my medium dark roast with oat milk, and begin the drive to work while listening to my playlist. About 10 minutes into my commute, I noticed that traffic was moving more slowly than usual. This was not particularly unusual, so I was not immediately concerned. Portland drivers tend to slow down dramatically when there is even the slightest bit of rain, and the roads had been wet that morning. As I continued driving north on Interstate 205, however, it became clear that this was not just typical cautious driving. This was a legitimate traffic jam. I could see red brake lights stretching ahead of me for what looked like miles. Cars were barely moving, occasionally advancing a few car lengths before coming to a complete stop again. I checked the time on my dashboard, 7:45. Under normal circumstances, I would arrive at work around 8, giving me a comfortable 30-minute buffer before my 8:30 start time. But as I sat in the nearly stationary traffic, sipping my coffee and watching the minutes tick by, I realized that my buffer was disappearing rapidly. By 8 o'clock, I had moved perhaps half a mile. The traffic was not clearing up. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that occasional delays were part of life, and that most reasonable people would understand. I had been a model employee for 3 years. Surely one instance of being a few minutes late due to circumstances completely beyond my control would not be a big deal. I called the office to let them know about the situation. Derek answered the phone with his typical brusque greeting. When I explained that I was stuck in traffic and would probably be about 10 minutes late, his response was immediate and unsympathetic. He told me that traffic was not an excuse for being late and that I should have left earlier if I wanted to ensure punctual arrival. He reminded me that the company had policies about tardiness, and that those policies applied to everyone regardless of their usual reliability. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, but his tone made it clear that I would be facing consequences for this delay. The traffic finally began moving around 8:20, but by then, it was too late. I arrived at the Cascade Distribution parking lot at 8:36, exactly 6 minutes after my scheduled start time. Those 6 minutes might as well have been 6 hours for all the difference it was going to make in Derek's eyes. I walked through the front entrance of the building, still carrying my coffee cup, and made my way toward the office area where our team worked. The warehouse was already in full swing, with workers moving pallets and the familiar sounds of machinery humming in the background. I was hoping to slip quietly to my desk and begin my workday without drawing attention to my late arrival. But Derek had other plans. As soon as I walked into the office area, Derek's voice boomed across the room loud enough for everyone to hear. Well, well, well. Look who decided to show up. Hey everyone, look at Mathia. Her morning coffee is more important to her than respecting her co-workers and being on time for work. The entire office fell silent. My cheeks burned with embarrassment as I felt every pair of eyes in the room turn toward me. Derek was clearly enjoying his moment of public humiliation. I tried to explain the situation calmly and professionally. I told him about the massive traffic jam on Interstate 205, how I had left at my usual time with plenty of buffer, and how I had called ahead to notify the office of the delay. I explained that I had purchased the coffee before encountering the traffic, as part of my normal routine, and that it had nothing to do with prioritizing personal convenience over work responsibilities. Derek was not interested in my explanation. He cut me off mid-sentence and continued his public lecture about responsibility, professionalism, and respect for company policies. He made sure that everyone in the office understood that being late was unacceptable regardless of the circumstances, and that my coffee cup was evidence of my misplaced priorities. The whole spectacle lasted about 5 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. After his public performance, Derek called me into his office for a private conversation. He pulled out a disciplinary action form and began filling it out while explaining that being late was a serious matter that required documentation. He told me that this write-up would go into my permanent file and that any future tardiness issues could result in more severe consequences, including potential termination. He made it clear that my 3 years of exemplary service meant nothing in the face of this single 6-minute delay. As I sat in Derek's office, watching him complete the paperwork that would officially document my first ever disciplinary action, something inside me shifted. The embarrassment and frustration I had been feeling began to transform into something else entirely, calculated anger. Derek had chosen to make an example of me in the most humiliating way possible, despite knowing that I was one of the most reliable employees on his team. He had ignored the circumstances, dismissed my explanation, and treated me like a chronic problem employee based on a single isolated incident. But as I reflected on the situation over the following days, I realized that Derek had inadvertently provided me with some very valuable information. His lecture about company policy had reminded me of something important. The disciplinary consequences for being late were the same, regardless of how late you were. Whether you were 5 minutes late or 5 hours late, the penalty was identical. This was supposed to simplify the disciplinary process and eliminate arguments about degrees of lateness, but it also created an interesting opportunity for someone who understood how to work within the system. The policy was designed with the assumption that most people would try to minimize their lateness once they realized they were going to be late. The idea was that even if you were going to face consequences, you would still try to get to work as quickly as possible to minimize the disruption. But what if someone decided to take a different approach? What if someone realized that they were going to face the maximum penalty anyway and decided to make the most of the situation? For the next couple of weeks, I returned to my normal routine. I arrived early every day, completed my work efficiently, and maintained my professional demeanor despite the lingering resentment I felt toward Derek. I was polite but distant with him, speaking only when necessary and keeping our interactions strictly professional. I could tell that he was pleased with himself for having established his authority so definitively, and he seemed to be waiting for another opportunity to demonstrate his power. That opportunity came on a Thursday morning in mid-November. I had left my apartment at the usual time and stopped at Grind Coffee for my regular order. The weather was particularly nasty that morning, with heavy rain and strong winds that made driving conditions challenging. As I merged onto Interstate 205, I immediately noticed that traffic was moving very slowly. Within a few minutes, it became apparent that this was going to be another significant delay. I checked the time, 7:55. Based on how slowly traffic was moving, I estimated that I would probably arrive at work around 8:45, making me about 15 minutes late. Under normal circumstances, this would have caused me significant stress. I would have spent the entire drive worrying about the consequences and trying to figure out how to minimize the impact of my tardiness. But these were not normal circumstances. I had already been publicly humiliated and officially disciplined for being 6 minutes late due to factors completely beyond my control. Derek had made it clear that he was not interested in context, explanations, or considering my overall track record. He had also inadvertently reminded me that the penalty for being 15 minutes late was exactly the same as the penalty for being 3 hours late. So I made a decision that would have been unthinkable just a few weeks earlier. Instead of continuing to sit in traffic and stress about being 15 minutes late, I took the next exit off the highway. I drove to a charming little breakfast place called Mockingbird Cafe that I had passed countless times but never had the opportunity to visit. I parked my car, walked inside, and asked for a table for one. The restaurant was warm and cozy, with exposed brick walls, local artwork, and the kind of comfortable atmosphere that made you want to linger over your meal. I ordered the full breakfast special: 2 eggs over easy, thick-cut bacon, hash browns, sourdough toast, and fresh orange juice. I also asked for a refill of coffee, something much better than my usual grab-and-go cup from Grind Coffee. For the next 2 hours, I sat in that restaurant and had the most relaxing morning I had experienced in months. I ate slowly, savoring every bite of the perfectly prepared food. I read articles on my phone, responded to some personal text messages, and simply enjoyed the luxury of not being rushed. I watched other customers come and go, observed the efficient teamwork of the restaurant staff, and allowed myself to fully disconnect from the stress and pressure of my normal routine. At around 10:45, I finally paid my check, left a generous tip, and drove to work. I arrived at Cascade Distribution at 11 o'clock, exactly 2.5 hours after my scheduled start time. As I walked through the front entrance, I felt calmer and more centered than I had in weeks. Derek was waiting for me, of course. His face was red with anger, and he immediately launched into a tirade about my unacceptable behavior and total disrespect for company policies. He demanded to know where I had been, and why I thought it was acceptable to simply not show up for work without any communication. I explained the situation with the same calm, professional tone I had used during our previous encounter. I told him about the traffic delay on Interstate 205 and how I had realized that I was going to be late regardless of what I did. I mentioned that since the company policy treated all instances of lateness the same way, I had decided to make the most of the situation by having a nice breakfast instead of sitting in stressful traffic. Derek was speechless for a moment. He clearly had not expected this response, and he seemed to be struggling to process what I had just told him. He sputtered something about this being completely different from being a few minutes late due to traffic, but I reminded him of his own words from our previous encounter. He had specifically told me that traffic was not an excuse for being late, and that company policies applied equally to everyone regardless of circumstances. The disciplinary action was identical to the one I had received for being 6 minutes late, a written warning that would go into my permanent file. Derek was furious, but there was nothing more he could do within the constraints of the company's own policies. He had created this situation through his rigid and unreasonable application of the rules, and now he was discovering that those same rules could work against him. Over the following months, I continued to maintain my usual schedule of arriving early almost every day, but whenever I encountered a situation where I was going to be more than 5 minutes late, I made a conscious decision to extend that lateness into something much more enjoyable. If I was going to face the same penalty regardless, I might as well make the most of the experience. There was the morning when construction delays were going to make me about 20 minutes late, so I stopped at Powell's Books and spent 2 hours browsing the stacks and reading in their comfortable chairs. There was the day when an accident on the Marquam Bridge was going to delay me by about 10 minutes, so I visited the Portland Art Museum and spent the morning wandering through their contemporary galleries. There was the rainy Tuesday when flooding on my usual route was going to make me 15 minutes late, so I treated myself to a massage at a day spa near my apartment. Each time I would arrive at work several hours late, completely relaxed and refreshed, and receive exactly the same disciplinary action that I would have gotten for being a few minutes late. Derek became increasingly frustrated with this pattern, but there was nothing he could do about it. The company policy was clear, and I was working entirely within its parameters. My coworkers began to notice the pattern as well. At first, some of them were confused by my behavior, but as I explained the logic behind my approach, several of them began to see the brilliance of it. A few even started adopting similar strategies when they found themselves facing unavoidable delays. The solidarity was subtle but noticeable, and it created an interesting dynamic in our office. Derek tried various approaches to address the situation. He spoke to his own supervisor about revising the tardiness policy, but was told that company-wide policy changes required approval from much higher up the chain, and that his concerns about one employee did not justify that level of bureaucratic effort. He attempted to create additional consequences for extended lateness, but was reminded that he needed to work within existing policies, and could not simply invent new rules to target specific employees. The most satisfying moment came about 6 months after this whole saga began. Derek had been consistently documenting every instance of my strategic lateness, building what he thought was a case for more serious disciplinary action. He scheduled a meeting with Human Resources and his own supervisor to discuss my pattern of unacceptable behavior and push for my termination. The meeting did not go as Derek had planned. When Human Resources reviewed my file, they saw 3 years of exemplary service, followed by a series of tardiness incidents that were all properly documented and handled according to company policy. They also noted that my work quality had remained consistently high and that I had not violated any other policies. Most importantly, they recognized that Derek had been applying the tardiness policy in an inconsistent and potentially discriminatory manner. The Human Resources representative pointed out that several other employees had been late during the same time period, but Derek had not documented their incidents with the same level of scrutiny. They questioned whether his focus on my behavior was motivated by legitimate policy enforcement or by personal animosity. They also noted that the tardiness policy was designed to address chronic lateness, not occasional delays due to circumstances beyond an employee's control. In the end, Derek received a formal counseling session about appropriate supervisory practices and consistent policy application. He was instructed to focus on actual performance issues rather than looking for opportunities to discipline employees who were otherwise meeting their responsibilities. The whole experience was deeply humiliating for him, especially since it had been initiated by his own complaint. The irony of the situation was not lost on anyone involved. Derek's rigid and unreasonable approach to policy enforcement had created exactly the kind of workplace conflict that the policies were designed to prevent. His attempt to establish authority through intimidation had backfired spectacularly, and he now found himself under scrutiny from his own supervisors. As for me, I continued working at Cascade Distribution for another year, before eventually accepting a position with a different company that offered better opportunities for advancement. My strategic approach to tardiness had taught me valuable lessons about understanding systems, working within established parameters, and finding creative solutions to workplace challenges. The whole experience changed my perspective on workplace dynamics and the importance of standing up for yourself when faced with unreasonable treatment. Derek had tried to make an example of me, but instead, I had made an example of how rigid adherence to policies without consideration for context or fairness could create unintended consequences. Looking back, I realized that those leisurely breakfast mornings were about more than just exploiting a policy loophole. They were about reclaiming my dignity and demonstrating that employees have more power than they often realize. Sometimes the most effective form of resistance is simply working within the system in ways that those in authority never anticipated. Derek learned that policies are tools that can be used by anyone who understands them well enough. I learned that standing up for yourself does not always require dramatic confrontation or emotional outbursts. Sometimes the most satisfying revenge is simply being smarter than the person who is trying to push you around.